usually what I'll do is lead this for a short period of time or an extended period of time to kind of build student interest and to begin to make them question their initial ideas. When I start this, I try to make students give a prediction. Try to tell me how long they think this plant will live, and if it's not going to live a normal lifespan, why is it not going to live a normal lifespan? So hopefully you've created your model, and now let's take a look forward into what you might encounter with the students. Alright, so some time has passed, and typically what I do is leave the plant that we've sold in a jar for some period of time to give the kids a chance to sort of build some wonder about what's going on, and to give us some opportunity to see some data. So what I've done here is I've taken a plant and sealed it in a jar several days ago, 4 days ago exactly, and this is where I'll begin the first lesson with kids in terms of teaching and things. So if you look at the sealed container in this situation, the first thing that the kids notice is that the plant stays very green. Students also begin to notice that there's moisture that accumulates on the side of the jar. I use the moisture on the side of the jar to generate some conversation about the water cycle. If the kids don't know the terms for the water cycle, I'll introduce evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and talk about how that process is being mimicked outside of the plant but inside the jar. That also allows me to sort of focus their attention on one question. If it's not raised by a kid, I raise that question. And the question I ask the students to consider is, what happens to the water that goes into the plant, and how is that going to affect the plant in terms of its overall health? So that's where we're at this point. So the students are making observations, they're seeing that there seems to be some moisture in the jar circulating, but now I've raised this sort of red herring, what about the water that goes into the jar? And then at this point I introduce some historical plant studies, and I take the kids back in history to give them a context for the work that scientists did to discover what does happen to water that goes into the plant and its roots. I talk about the belief that scientists held that water was made from primarily plants, that plants were made from primarily water and soil. And for several centuries, there was a great debate about, is a plant water or is it mostly soil? I introduced the story of a guy named Van Helmont, and Van Helmont did a series of experiments that focused on plants coming from soil. And the most famous experiment that he conducted involved him planting a small willow tree in a container of dirt and letting that willow tree grow for several years. Before starting the experiment, he weighed or massed the willow tree, that was a small tree, and determined how much it weighed, and determined exactly the weight of the dirt that he put in this container. He was careful to make sure that little or no dirt spilled from his container, and he let that plant grow for several years. At the end of several years, he came back and weighed how much the tree had grown and compared that to how much soil was lost from the container. And to his surprise, he found that his plant grew significantly. I think it's like 195 pounds, whereas the soil only lost 2 ounces. This was sort of proof to scientists of his day that plants probably don't come from soil, and that led them to begin looking at what other substances could plants come from. And several scientists began focusing on the idea that plants were made primarily of water. That's where Stephen Hales comes into the story. Stephen Hales was a scientist who lived in the 1800s, and he focused his work on the question of what happens to the water that goes into plant roots. And what I'd like to do now is engage you in an activity that will mimic one of his experiments, to help you better understand what happens to the water that goes into plants, and to provide you with some activities that you can show your students, and then give you an opportunity to talk about what's going on with water in plants. So we're outside, and I'm wanting to demonstrate for you what you can do to show kids what happens with water in plants. So to do that, you need your Ziploc baggie in any plant. Just about any plant will work. I picked a rose bush, hoping I don't prick my fingers. And all I want to do is pick any bunch of the plant and use the baggie to cover it. When I've covered it, I want to seal it as tight as I can around the plant.
and leave it. Now, this works best in a sunny location with a plant that's got lots of water and some other factors that make a difference. But just about any location that's sunny with any type of plant that will work. So now what we want to do is just leave this for a few minutes and then we'll come back and see what we notice. So here we are, it's been less than 5 minutes. You can already start to see some evidence of moisture accumulating inside the baggie. When I work with young kids, they use words like mist and fog to describe what it is they're seeing. And this is the place where I do some sort of direct instruction with kids. I try to basically tell them the stuff that they might not be able to figure out on their own. This is where I introduce the idea of water coming through the plant leaves, through the stomata, that I'll show you in just a second. Some tidbits about this process. There's a fancy name for what's occurring. This is called transpiration. Every plant transpires water from its roots up through its stems and out the leaves to the stomata. Depending on the plant type and the condition, different amounts of water are transpired by plants. I grow tomatoes in my yard. A tomato plant can transpire gallons of water in the summertime through the plant and out through the leaves. An oak tree can transpire hundreds of gallons in a year. If you have an acre of corn, it can transpire something like 400,000 gallons of water through the plants in a single year. So this process is very active, it's very dynamic, but it's hidden from lots of people who don't understand that most of the water that goes into a plant roots comes out through the leaves of the stomata.